on Brute Force, the history of weapons at war. Air-land battle, the master plan behind the victory in Desert Storm. Without it, even the most powerful weapons are rendered useless. From the stalemate of World War I French warfare to the power of the Nazi blitzkrieg to the firefights in the jungles of Vietnam, this is the quest for the ultimate war-fighting doctrine, air-land battle. Next on Brute Force, the history of weapons at war.
Land warfare has been revolutionized 4 times since the turn of the century. The first change was the denial of mobility in the stalemate of World War I. The second saw the restoration of mobility with tanks and aircraft in World War II. The third change can be seen as the defeat of technology by the guerrilla fighters of Vietnam. However, the fourth revolution in land warfare was the victory of technology in Operation Desert Storm. That success validated not only the sophisticated weapons, but also the U.S. Army's new war-fighting doctrine, the air-land battle. As forces arrived in Saudi Arabia, the United States Army prepared to fight a war like no other in its history. Highly trained forces with an incredible array of technology at their disposal. 5 weapons in particular were developed to help the Army execute the intricate and cohesive melding of air and ground forces known as air-land battle. The M1A1 Abrams main battle tank, the cornerstone of the ground forces. The M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, fast enough to keep the infantry alongside the tanks. In the air, the Apache attack helicopter, a flying fortress, can support the armored columns on the ground. The Black Hawk utility helicopter moves troops and artillery quickly. And the Patriot missile provides small crews with a very effective means of air defense. However, to win battles, an army needs more than equipment and highly trained troops. An army must have an effective framework or battle doctrine in which to operate in order to achieve victory.
Doctrine is the signally most important aspect of constructing a fighting force. It's the statement of how you intend to fight and win. In the case of land power, doctrine focuses all of the various operating systems that you have that need to be brought to a certain point at a certain time to achieve the intent of the commander. Doctrine is the script that brings all of that together.
After Vietnam, there is much assessment of what was done, what could have been done better, and there gradually grew what is come to be termed the air-land battle, in which the units of the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy are integrated so that all of the assaults that are made are orchestrated to optimize them. And I think in both Panama and in Iraq, you saw the greatest exposition of the air-land battle theories.
Right now, all of the American air-land battle doctrine essentially centers on the orchestrated employment of 7 battlefield operating systems. And they are maneuver, fire support, command and control, intelligence, combat service support, mobility, counter-mobility, and survivability, and air defense. And we think by those combination of capabilities, if you ensure that they are integrated to achieve a focused purpose as defined by the script, as defined by the doctrine, we basically will have the capabilities such that whatever the intent of the commander is can in fact be enabled.
The shock action and the speed of our maneuver, which is air-land battle. We've been talking it in the Army for 20 years and then finally got the option to go out and say, this is what we're talking about. This is how it works. You synchronize everything, you get your artillery going, your attack helicopters going, your air going, all at the critical time and place with the ground forces, and it's going to happen. It's going to work.
The concept of combining different types of units to create a more effective force is hardly new. The Roman army used chariots to increase the mobility of their forces while still depending on foot soldiers for the main attack. As technology improved, cavalry, artillery guns, and infantry soldiers worked together on a more complex battlefield. Balloons added another dimension, allowing an army to spot enemy formations and prepare countermeasures or fire artillery shells deep into the battlefield. As forces began to mobilize for war in Europe, most military strategists assumed that World War I would be conducted the same way that battles had been fought since the times of Napoleon.
In the Franco-Prussian War, and then in World War I, countries were defending entire territories, their whole countryside, so they had these long lines that covered the entire front between their country and the other country. And the Germans, in the early part of World War I, thought they were going to achieve a breakthrough and destroy the French forces very quickly.
Indeed, the war began with a classic flanking maneuver devised by the German Chief of Staff, Alfred von Schlieffen. The German army swept through Belgium and into the northern part of France. As expected, French troops continued to take the most direct route to the front, unaware of Schlieffen's maneuver. The German forces completely encircled the French and won the first few encounters easily as they continued to move south. Fortunately for the French, the Kaiser's troops were exhausted after their 300-mile march, and there was little food left for the horses carrying supplies and towing artillery pieces. In fact, German forces cut their maneuver short, descending to the east of Paris instead of circling behind the city. The French army was now in position to launch a counterattack on the exposed German flank just 20 miles outside of Paris at the Marne River.
About the 30th of August, they were at Meaux on the Meuse River. And this was only about 20 or 30 miles from Paris. And this was where the Battle of the Marne took place. There were two Battles of the Marne. This was the first one. The French rushed out reinforcements. They had used taxi cabs. They had all the transport taken up. They used taxi cabs, brought enough infantry out there. They were finally able to stop the Germans at that point. That was the high point of the German advance into France. That was as far as they ever got. Now remember, by that time, the Germans, in less than a month, had moved around 350 miles from the German border all the way across Belgium and all the way across northern France that far. So their supply lines they just couldn't handle that type of thing that rapidly.
As the advance halted, the effects of recent technological improvements such as more accurate rifles, rapid-firing machine guns, and long-range high-explosive artillery shells could now be seen. Trains and trucks quickly brought more troops, guns, and supplies to the front. This war would certainly not be fought as the generals had planned. Unable to penetrate each other's defenses, both the Allied and German armies began to dig trenches to provide some protection before the next attack. But if technology was dictating a change in battlefield strategy, the generals weren't listening. Fighting continued. The trenches became deeper and longer until they stretched across virtually the entire front from the English Channel to the Alps. World War I became a war of attrition where victories were measured in terms of enemy casualties instead of territory gain. Intense artillery and mortar fire would precede a frontal assault by the infantry, who would soon become trapped in barbed wire, or gunned down by machine gun fire, or blasted by enemy artillery. When these assaults failed, the generals assumed the enemy had not been properly softened up. Instead of one day of artillery barrages before an attack, there would now be 1 week or more. Such was the case at the Battle of Verdun.
It was fought in 1916, and it turned out to be the bloodiest battle of, I think, the bloodiest battle of all wars. The Germans launched a massive offensive towards Verdun, which was a heavily fortified city. The French immediately began to rush up reinforcements because this long barrage gave them plenty of warning, and they rushed up reinforcements, rushed them up. And the French started their counter barrages. And the battle raged on from February on up until June. It lasted for right at 5 months, and it just became a horrendous slaughter. The French lost around 550,000 men, and the Germans lost around 450,000 men in this battle. This is 1 million men. This was the largest, heaviest casualties in any battle in any war ever.
Months and years passed. The utter waste of life continued as the surviving troops suffered through the ordeal. The military leaders had no new strategy. Could technology come to the rescue? As World War I dragged on, it became clear that the infantry needed some form of protection when making their assaults, something which could bring mobility back to the field of battle. The British worked in secret on an armored tractor-like vehicle, and on the open fields of Cambrai, they unveiled their revolutionary new weapon.
In the Battle of Cambrai, they had assembled about 400 tanks. They had their effect upon the Germans. They broke through, but the lack of exploitive methods, they no longer had a cavalry that they could pour through the hole that would have been effective, perhaps. So that, in effect, the tanks became mobile units for protecting infantrymen on their advance. And this was a retrograde step in the thinking of the advanced tankmen of the time, who saw it, as all the great tankmen did, as great penetrators of going behind the lines and breaking up the communications.
Planes were also emerging as a weapon which could open up the battlefield. They could be used to bomb enemy forces on the ground with small hand-dropped explosives, to scout deep behind enemy lines, or to deny the enemy the use of his plane. Eventually, they were even used together in larger formations.
Billy Mitchell organized the great 1,500 plane air fleet that was used in the San Miguel attack. And it was the first time that a large fleet had been used systematically to control a battlefield. And he divided them so that he had 500 airplane brigades on either side of the San Miguel salient, and systematically suppressed the German air, and then systematically beat up the German ground troops in a way that had never done before, and which really prophesied the future.
With the help of the tank and the airplane, the Allies were able to gain precious ground. They had been winning the battle of attrition thanks to a large number of reinforcements from America, and now they had the upper hand in mobility as well. However, the early versions of these two weapons hardly represented true mobility.
The bottom line was that we had surprise, had immediate success with air and tanks, but they really did not have the battlefield significance that they should have, because they were essentially new capabilities that were presented really without an encompassing doctrine that would ensure that they would be used effectively and efficiently to the purpose of the commander.
It was in the years between the world wars that the technological and tactical advances were made, leading to the restoration of mobility in World War II.
Between World War I and World War II, the Armored Division was, as far as we were concerned, was a new idea. You combine tanks and armored infantry, that would be infantry motorized riding in half tracks. And then you have armored artillery, that would be self-propelled artillery. And you put those three arms together and then support them with engineers and signal and medics and maintenance and supply, and you had a completely self-contained unit. The British developed the concept simultaneously, and the Germans had developed this concept also. But the only problem was that we didn't have enough weapons, we didn't have enough money. The total ground forces in the Army between World War I and World War II were 136,000 men, 6,000 officers. and that just wasn't enough to train properly.
Most of the conceptual work on the evolution of the doctrine during the interwar period was done by the British. Some was done by the French. The Russians, under Marshal Tukhachevsky, were very, very advanced. And the Germans, of course, the Guderians and the Fullers. These were the individuals that, some of whom were noted in World War II, but they really did a lot of their major work during the interwar period. But this work, again, was really not being done within the United States.
It is ironic to think that Germany, the one country which was restricted by treaty from building any new weapons, was the most prepared to fight another war. France believed a defensive doctrine would protect it from any invaders and developed the Maginot Line, a chain of concrete and steel fortifications linked by underground tunnels. The French Army's offensive arsenal was no stronger than it had been at the end of World War I. Suddenly, in 1939, Hitler unleashed the new German warfighting doctrine as Poland became the first victim of Blitzkrieg.
The concept and the practice of Blitzkrieg had reached the point where the German army could virtually carry it out as a drill. They would suddenly lay down vast areas of fire from artillery pieces. They would be supplemented by dive bombers. They would be supplemented by the infantry mortars. Anything that could be brought to bear on one particular area of landscape where the unfortunate enemy was would be saturated. They would be saturated to such a point that when the armour moved forward, there was virtually nothing to stop it. It would pour through that gap.
As soon as the German ground forces began to move, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, took to the air, nullifying any possible threat from Polish air forces. Soon Germany's neighbors to the east had been crushed, and Hitler turned his attention to France in the west. Instead of trying to attack the Maginot Line directly, the German army simply swept around it and headed for Belgium instead. A well-coordinated attack using paratroopers and artillery crushed the fortress of Eben-Emael as Hitler's forces poured into France. Having outflanked France's static defense lines, the German army quickly moved towards Paris. The French army's defensive doctrine had failed, and its World War I vintage weapons were no match for the Blitzkrieg.
Prior to the invasion of France in 1940, the British and French had more tanks than the Germans. Some of our tanks were very good, but we did not know really how to use our tanks. We tended to spread them too thin, where the Germans would concentrate their armour and use it en masse. We had the tanks, we had the artillery, but we could not really use them as a combined arms team. Therefore, we lost the Battle of France.
Soon Paris had been captured. The Allies had been caught on their heels, just as they had been in World War I. The small, under-equipped American army was in no position to offer immediate assistance. Germany had proved beyond a doubt that the key to future victories was the unlimited use of mobile, overwhelming firepower.
No próximo programa, Rommel revoluciona as táticas de combate.